let's talk about drawing fur with watercolor pencils. Now, I actually always follow exactly the same steps. I very much have a process. So I'm going to share that process with you today, and I can show you by drawing this very sweet little squirrel. Now, before we get into the actual method, let's briefly cover some of the materials that you need to use. And the most important material you need is some watercolor paper. We're going to build up this pencil by building it up in a series of layers. And what we need is a paper that's going to be able to take those layers and also cope when we activate those layers with water, something that a standard printer paper wouldn't be able to do. Now, I particularly like using 100% cotton paper. Paper like this is what I find to be the most effective. Now, beyond the paper, you'll obviously also need some watercolor pencils. I use the Faber-Castell watercolor pencils. A paintbrush, this is nothing fancy. It is a watercolor paintbrush though. And of course some water. And that is all you need. Now, before we get into the actual process, if you would like to go through this with me in a lot more detail, it is available on my Patreon. I have loads of tutorials in not only watercolored pencils, but also colored pencils and graphite. Each of my tutorials includes really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colors I'll be using, sketch outlines, and of course the reference photo. I have some tutorials that are nice, quick and simple, and also some much more complicated drawings. Do check out the link in the description. Now, my general method for always drawing with watercolor pencils, and it's exactly the same with fur, is to start with the lighter colors and gradually work my way towards the darker colors. So I want to be doing that in the same way as normal. I'm starting out by just blocking in all of the lightest colors. Now, we're not worrying about building up any sort of fur texture here. That is going to happen much later on. What I want to be doing is looking at the underlying colors in the fur, and I want to be adding in the lightest color in each area. So on this squirrel, actually a lot of it is a series of grays. So I can start off with a particularly light cold gray, just put down some blocks of color anywhere where I can see this color, and then I can move on to a slightly darker cold gray, still very light but darker than the other one. Now, the keys here when building up these colors is to be working firstly nice and lightly. I want to be able to layer a lot of color. If I pressed really hard with the pencil, it wouldn't be possible to build up the amount of pencil that I'm going to need. I also want to be working as smoothly as possible. So I'm working in some really small circular motions or kind of oval motions to try and get down the pencil in as smooth and consistent way as possible. So once I've filled in those grays, I can see a little bit of pink, for example, and a little bit of a kind of orangey brown. This is all part of getting the general framework, just those underlying colors of the squirrel. Now, where the tail is obviously so much longer fur, it's particularly fluffy. I'm not worrying about adding in any of those fluffy sections. I just want to draw in the center of the tail, the area that is the most dense, the thickest fur. Once I'm happy with these lightest pencils, I can activate this with the water. Generally speaking, I want to start from the lighter areas and then activate towards the darker areas. And I can't stress enough, you don't expect it to look good at this point, or to be honest, for quite a while yet. Now, before moving on to the next step, I always want to wait for the pencil to completely dry. I don't want to be trying to build up more pencil on even slightly damp paper, so I always leave it for at least half an hour. From here, I can move on to the mid-tones. So I want to be looking for the mid-tones in each area. And it's very similar to what I was doing with the lightest color. I once again want to be looking at those underlying colors of the fur. So I can go back to the darker cold gray and add some more of this in. It is more of a mid-tone, really, particularly if I build up a bit more of the pencil. Now, do bear in mind that I'm not pressing harder with the pencil. If I want to build up more of the color, I'm going over an area more times rather than applying more pressure. And again, that just applies a much smoother, more even coverage of the pencil rather than how scratchy it would look if I pressed much firmer. I can also add in a little bit of a reddish brown, just really looking at the shapes on the face. Once I'm happy with those midtones, I can once again activate it with the water in the same way that I did before, and then once again wait for it to completely dry. I can then do the same with the darkest colours. And there's not a huge amount that needs doing here. It's mostly the black of the eye as well as quite a few dark brown shadowed areas. But as I say, there's not loads to add add on this particular squirrel. Once again, I can activate this with the water, and then what I have is a really good template of a squirrel. It's obviously got absolutely no texture. It doesn't exactly look furry, but all of those base layers are built up so that I'm not just working on white paper now. Now at this point, I do want to start adding in some fur texture, and I'm going to be using a lot of the same colors that I've already been using. Now what we'll be doing is filling in the fur texture, and then we will once again be activating this with the water. Now there's a few different things that I think about when adding in the fur. First up, how I use my pencil. So in order to add this fur texture, what I need to do is gently flick my pencil against the paper. I just want to brush it against the paper, which makes these really nice and gentle marks. Now it is well worth practicing doing this. You want to be making it so nice and light so you don't end up with really thick, unsightly lines. I can make smaller flicks if it's shorter fur and longer flicks if it's longer fur. Now the next thing I want to be particularly thinking about is the direction of the fur, because fur doesn't all go consistently in one direction. Now because I'm working from a reference photo here, I can use that reference photo to really look at where it's going. But on the most part, it is going in a reasonably consistent way. I think it goes a little bit crazy around the ears. So I can make, as I say, those longer flicks or shorter flicks depending on the direction and the length of the fur. And I can work through all of those colors, building this up so that it looks a little bit more like a furry squirrel. Once I'm happy with all of this very basic fur texture, what I want to do is once again activate this with the water. And this is the last time that I'll be doing this. So I can flick my paintbrush against the paper, particularly on the areas of longer fur around the tail, to continue to build up that texture, that fur texture. And now I have a squirrel that does look like a squirrel. What I want to do at this point is add in all of the details and really tweak this to give it that extra realistic look. So I like to work one section at a time. So starting off really focusing on the head and the front paws, adding in some more texture, so some more of those flicking motions. It is so important when doing this that you have a nice and sharp pencil so that you can make some really nice fine flicks. I can also really refine the shape of the paws. There's a lot of detail in the paws, and I'm just not able to get that detail in when I'm activating with the water. So I've got the very rough shapes in here, and I can just gradually build up the pencil to add in that finer detail. So I like to work on the top section first, and then I can do exactly the same on the bottom section. So really improving the back legs, adding in all of this extra fur texture onto the body of the squirrel. And then once I'm happy that I've added in all of those details and the squirrel is generally looking reasonably accurate, I can then start tweaking the colors. So what I want to do is soften everything and make it look a lot more fluffy. So I go back over the top of all of those base layers and all of that fur texture that I built up with circular motions. Once again, nice and smooth coverage of the pencil. I want to stop adding in the texture now and just really brightening up any colors that I think look maybe a little bit washed out, maybe a little bit weak. And this is a really important step that I think a lot of people miss out on. But if you look at the difference on the squirrel before I've done this and after, it just looks so much brighter and so much fluffier. So I actually think with drawing fur with watercolored pencils, there's less fur texture to add than you would expect. Obviously it is still a large part of the drawing, but most of what I'm doing is applying some smooth color and really getting those base layers built up and then getting the top layers built up as well, so that you end up with a much smoother fur texture. Now I hope that you found this helpful. Do remember, if you want to go through this in a lot more detail, it is available on my Patreon. And if you want to look at a much more simple watercolor pencil drawing, do check out my beginner's guide here. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.